It happened a few years ago. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night. I don't really know if I believe in things like fate or energy or any of that stuff, but what happened that night in the morgue still gives me chills. I worked in a laboratory that handled autopsies and preparations for funerals. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was honest work. You get used to the smell, the coldness of the place, the silence. Most of the time, it was routine. But sometimes, something would happen that made you question everything. That night was one of the busiest shifts I ever had. We had more bodies than usual, and my team was stretched thin. The funeral director had brought in a woman, a gypsy woman. I didn't know much about her, just that she had been the victim of a hit-and-run accident. The way they talked about her, though, made it clear she was someone important to her community. They were very particular about how she was supposed to be dressed. When the funeral director arrived, he pulled me aside. "Grace, pay close attention, okay?" he said. "Her skirt is here, her blouse is transparent, so the family wants you to put the scarf over the blouse." He made sure I understood exactly how the scarf should be placed, how important it was. I nodded, took the scarf, and set it aside with the rest of her clothes, making sure to be careful. I knew how much these things meant to the family. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was something more. The night went on. It was one of those shifts where you don't even realize how much time has passed because you're just moving from one thing to the next. Autopsies, paperwork, prepping bodies, it all blurred together. By the end of my shift, I was exhausted. We always did a final check before leaving, making sure everything was in place, and that's when I noticed. The scarf was missing. I froze. My stomach dropped. I looked at the woman's body, fully dressed except for the scarf. I knew I'd placed it with her things. I was sure of it. I turned to my coworker who had been working with me that night. "Where's the scarf?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He gave me a blank look. "What scarf?" "The scarf? The one for the gypsy woman. It was with her clothes. The funeral director told me she couldn't go without it." "There was no scarf," he said, frowning. "Are you sure you had it?" I felt like screaming. Of course, I was sure. I remembered the funeral director's words. I remembered holding it. I remembered setting it down, and now it was gone. We searched everywhere, the tables, the floor, the storage areas. We checked the cabinets, the preparation room, even inside the body bags of the other deceased, just in case it had gotten mixed up somehow. Nothing. The scarf had vanished. Panic set in. I knew how important it was. The family was expecting her to have it. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a sign of disrespect. My job was to make sure everything was in order. If I received something, I had to put it on. And I failed. I felt this overwhelming sense of guilt. It wasn't like misplacing a file or forgetting a small detail. This was personal. This was sacred. I didn't know what else to do. I stood there, staring at her, and without thinking, I whispered, "Please, help me find it." I don't know why I said it. Maybe I was desperate, maybe I was losing my mind, but the second the words left my mouth, I felt it. It wasn't like a gust of wind or a voice or anything dramatic. It was just a feeling, a pull, like something inside me suddenly knew where to look. My feet moved before I even realized it. I walked toward the trash can in the corner of the room. It was one of those industrial-sized bins, full of discarded gloves, masks, bloody gauze, things you wouldn't want to touch without protection. I hesitated. It didn't make sense. We wouldn't have thrown the scarf away, but the feeling wouldn't let go. I reached in, sifting through the mess. My fingers brushed against something soft, something that didn't belong there. My heart pounded as I pulled it out. The scarf. It was crumpled, slightly stained, but still intact. I stared at it, my hands shaking. I turned to my coworker. "I found it." His face went pale. "Where was it?" I swallowed. "The trash." He frowned. Who the hell would throw it in there? I didn't answer. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I took the scarf and carefully placed it over her blouse, the way the funeral director had instructed. And as I did, that feeling, the strange energy, the pull, vanished, like it had done what it needed to do. We never figured out how it ended up in the trash. No one admitted to moving it. No one remembered seeing it after I first set it down, but it didn't matter. In the end, she had what she needed. I work in a morgue. I won't say where, but it's not a big place. We don't get a lot of bodies every night, but when they do come in, sometimes you get this feeling, like an electric charge in the air. I don't know how to explain it, but if you've worked around the dead long enough, you start to notice it. Some bodies feel different than others. That night, we got a woman, an older lady, maybe in her late 60s. Nothing weird about her, at least not in the way she died. I won't go into details, but let's just say it wasn't violent. No trauma, no wounds, just an older woman who passed away. Happens all the time. But when they wheeled her in, I felt it. That energy, that charge in the air, and I could tell Emily felt it too. Emily was one of the assistants. She wasn't new, but she wasn't as used to things as I was. I'd been working in this place for years and I had seen my share of weird moments. But this was the first time I saw something. So, like I said, we got this woman in and I started doing what I always do. There's a process, a routine. We have to treat the body, especially the abdominal cavity, to stop bacteria from spreading. There's this fluid we use, and once we apply it, we have to let it sit for about 40 minutes. That's standard, nothing unusual. I was chatting with Emily while I worked, and I told her, "Hey, since I'm going to be alone for the night shift, just stay by the door. Talk to me so I don't fall asleep standing up." We were just passing time, nothing serious. Once I applied the fluid, I figured I had some time to kill, so I told Emily, "Let's step outside for a coffee, maybe a cigarette. Then I'll come back and finish up." She agreed, and I turned off the lights in the lab before we left, leaving the body there. We weren't outside long, maybe 15, 20 minutes. It was quiet. The place is always quiet at night, but that night felt even quieter. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like everything was holding its breath. We went back inside and I told Emily she could go back to her desk while I finished up. I walked into the lab and turned on the light. And then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The body was still on the table just like I left it. But standing beside it, right at its side was a shadow, a figure. The exact same height, the exact same shape as the woman lying there. For a second, I froze. My brain couldn't catch up with what I was seeing. It wasn't floating, it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, no sound, no movement. Just a shape in the dim light. I blinked. It was still there. I took a step forward and I swear, the air in the room got heavier. Like the whole space got smaller. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I reached out toward the light switch like maybe if I turned the light off and on, it would go away. And then, just as I did, the shape, whatever it was, wasn't there anymore. Just gone. Like it had never been there in the first place. The woman was still lying on the table, exactly as I left her. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. But I know what I saw. I don't remember finishing the procedure that night. I must have, because everything was logged and done when I checked the next morning. But I don't remember doing it. I just remember standing there for a long time, staring at that spot where the shadow had been. I didn't tell Emily. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? "Hey, I saw a shadow in the lab that looked just like the body on the table." No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believe myself. But ever since that night, I've paid more attention to that feeling. That electric charge when a new body comes in. Because now I wonder, Does it mean something? I never thought working in a morgue would change the way I saw death. It was supposed to be just another job, cold, quiet, and routine. But one particular night as I was doing my rounds, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about life and death. I work the night shift in the city morgue. It's not as eerie as people think. It's mostly paperwork, cataloging, and making sure the bodies are where they're supposed to be. No flickering lights, no strange whispers, just the hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional creak of metal drawers expanding with the change in temperature. That night started like any other. I had finished my coffee and was getting ready to process the latest intake when I noticed something odd. An extra body. There are strict procedures for handling the deceased. Every body is tagged, logged, and recorded before it's brought into cold storage. But when I counted, there was one more than there should have been. I frowned and checked the paperwork. 4 new arrivals tonight. I had accounted for 3. The 4th wasn't on my list. I wheeled the gurney under the fluorescent light and pulled back the sheet. The body was that of a man, mid-40s, average build, no visible injuries. No tag, no identifying bracelet. No record of arrival. That wasn't just a mistake. That was a serious breach. I checked the surrounding area. The main entrance to the morgue is locked. The security cameras cover every corridor. No one can just walk in here unnoticed. I grabbed the phone and called upstairs to confirm the intake records. "Hey, I think we have an issue," I said. "There's a body down here that's not on the logs." The nurse on the other end hesitated. "That's impossible. We only sent down 4, and they're all accounted for." "Then explain why there's an extra one lying on my table." Silence. "Let me check," she said. I heard the clatter of keys on a keyboard. No extra bodies were brought in tonight." I hung up. That left one possibility. Someone had brought this body in without documentation. I took another look at him. His skin was pale, but not yet in the stages of rigor mortis. His arms were resting at his sides, fingers slightly curled. His chest was still. No breath, no pulse. Yet, something felt off. I examined his eyes. They were half open, the way they sometimes are when people pass away suddenly. But there was something about them that unsettled me. They didn't have that empty, sunken look I was used to seeing. I pressed down on his wrist, testing for resistance. It was stiff, but not as cold as it should have been. I ran a quick test, shining a small light into his pupils. And then, they contracted. I stumbled back, my pulse spiking. No, that wasn't possible. Pupils don't respond if someone is truly dead. I swallowed hard and did the only logical thing I could think of. I checked the records again. I searched through every intake log, every death certificate issued in the past 24 hours. Nothing, no name, no paperwork, no report. This body didn't exist. I should have called security, should have reported it immediately. But I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if I was overreacting? I turned back toward the table, and my stomach dropped. The body's left hand had moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But I was sure it had been resting, palm down, just moments ago. Now, the fingers were curled slightly inward, as if gripping the edge of the table. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my fingers to his neck, right under the jaw. Nothing. I waited. Still nothing. Maybe I imagined it, maybe I was tired. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move through the motions. I had a job to do. I logged him manually as unidentified male and prepared him for storage. I slid the gurney toward the refrigeration unit. The heavy metal drawer creaked as I pulled it open. Just as I was about to lift the body, my radio crackled. "Hey, we need you upstairs," a voice called. It was my supervisor. I exhaled and stepped away, leaving the gurney near the drawer. On my way, the request was simple, just a signature for a delayed report. It took less than 10 minutes. When I returned, I stopped cold. The gurney was empty. The sheet that had covered the body was lying crumpled on the floor. A chill ran down my spine. I checked every row of storage units, every table, every door. Nothing. I was the only one in the morgue. There were no signs of forced entry. No opened doors. No records of anyone coming in or out. The body was just gone. I stood there for a long time waiting, expecting something, anything, to explain what had just happened. But nothing did. By the time my shift ended, I had convinced myself it was all in my head. I buried myself in paperwork, pretending nothing had happened. The next night, I clocked in as usual, just another shift in the morgue, pretending I hadn't seen what I saw.